Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. On behalf of Alan Broadbent, the chair of the board of IMFG, who's here today, and the other board members and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you here to our session on What We Do is What We Fund, the Future of Toronto's City Finances. And our guest speaker today is Peter Wallace, the city manager for Toronto. Today's session is the 5th annual IMFG event with the Toronto City Manager, and the second with Peter Wallace. The idea behind this annual event is to get an update every year on how the city is doing financially, the current challenges it faces, and the opportunities that lie ahead. As many of you may recall, Peter was pretty new to the job last year, and he went through a thought experiment with us about Toronto's future fiscal sustainability. Now that he's been in office for over a year and he's an expert, we've asked him to return to that experiment. What is the fiscal situation of Toronto today? Does the city have the right toolkit to maintain high-quality public services and invest in needed infrastructure? What do we need to put us on the right track? Many of you were here last year, and as you may recall, the Blue Jays were in the ALCS last year, and they were playing a game during Peter's talk. You may recall we were yelling out the score from time to time. I'm wondering if we're beginning to see a pattern here. Peter gives an annual address at IMFG, the Blue Jays get into the ALCS. Sounds pretty good. At least this year, the Jays showed us a little more respect by waiting until Peter is finished to actually play Game 3. So thank you to the Blue Jays. Before I introduce our moderator for this afternoon, I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for everything they did to make this event happen today, in particular Selena Zhang and Jenny Warden. I'd like to ask that you not use flash photography as we are webcasting the event today. If you are tweeting about the event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. So let's turn to the event. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Shirley Hoy. Shirley's public service career in both the municipal and provincial government has spanned more than 30 years. Perhaps most relevant to her role as moderator today, Shirley was city manager for the City of Toronto from 2001 to 2008. So she certainly understands the fiscal challenges that the city faces. After leaving the city, Shirley spent 5 years as the CEO of the Toronto Lands Corporation, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Toronto District School Board, responsible for managing and disposing of surplus school properties. Shirley is currently the chair of the Governing Council of the University of Toronto. Please welcome Shirley Hoy.
Thank you, Enid. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and honored to be a moderator for this 5th annual IMFG Toronto City Manager's Address. As Enid already indicated, the focus for discussion this afternoon is the future of the Toronto city finances. So the two key questions are, does the city have the right toolkit to fund high-quality public services and badly needed capital improvements? And do we have a solid foundation on which to position our city building objectives? We've been down this road before a few times, but we haven't got to the end of the rainbow in the pot of gold yet, and we're hoping Peter will take us there. So Toronto is not alone in these challenges. These are questions that all municipalities in Ontario, and indeed in Canada, are currently considering. You may be aware that the Association of Municipalities of Ontario has been having these discussions with its members for more than a year now. Their discussion is called What's Next, Ontario. The long-term fiscal health is an issue which unites all municipal governments, from the smallest to the largest. Peter Wallace, as Enid already indicated, although only a few months into the job as city manager at the time, started this conversation last year about the future of Toronto's fiscal sustainability. Given his distinguished public service in the provincial government and the various portfolios that he held, it was not a surprise to me that Peter would jump right in with provocative and out-of-the-box questions about the way we tackle fiscal challenges. Just a reminder then on Peter's public service career to this point. Currently, as the city manager, he's directly responsible for over 30,000 staff, over $12 billion operating budget, and $32 billion 10-year capital plan. With more than 30 years in public service, he has served as Secretary of Cabinet, Head of the Ontario Public Service, Clerk of the Executive Council, Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of Treasury Board, Deputy Minister of Energy, and Deputy Minister, Associate Secretary of the Cabinet. Peter began his public service career in 1981 after completing Honour BA in Political Economy and a Master of Public Administration from the University of Toronto, a good place. I first met Peter when he was Deputy of Finance. Joe Penichetti, at the time, the CFO, and I did our annual treks up to the province to present the city's annual operating and capital budgets. Peter was no pushover. He asked very insightful, difficult questions, which showed not only that he had read the file, but also had given thoughtful consideration to the various public policy implications for the province and for the city. Before I turn the podium over to Peter, I want to declare a bias. I believe strongly that we're very fortunate to have Peter as the leader of the Toronto Public Service at this time. He's the right person, at the right place, at the right time. Looking back at 18 years since amalgamation in 1998, each of the previous three managers, the three city managers, myself included, dealt with very different priorities and crises. The first city manager was Mike Garrett. In the immediate post-amalgamation chaos of merging 7 municipalities, the priority of Mike's tenure was focused on ensuring no service disruption and beginning the process of major restructuring of the departments. In my years as a city manager, I dealt with major controversies such as the MFP public inquiry, the Union Station procurement audit, and the beginning of building a new culture for the Toronto Public Service. Under Joe Penichetti's leadership, great strides were made towards some new, more sustainable fiscal foundation. I recall in Joe's last presentation here, he noted that if other financial tools were secure for transit and social housing, the city's financial house would be in pretty good shape. So now, Peter's thought experiment continues this journey of how best to achieve long-term city building objectives while at the same time dealing with the immediate financial challenges. So Peter, podium is yours.
Thanks so much for that overly kind introduction, and I can really only go down from there, can I? So I want to spend a minute, and I'm going to treat this as a technical audience. I'm going to treat this as an annual gathering of fellow public policy, public finance nerds. I'm not even going to approach the mic. I'm just going to yell. I actually do want to spend a second just talking about my somewhat silly title. And what I want to emphasize through this is that, governments have influence through a variety of mechanisms, and the City of Toronto has its influence through two primary mechanisms. The first is regulation, and the city has things like city plans, all of that other stuff that are fundamental to shaping the structure and other aspects of the city. And that's important, but in my view, what the city really does fundamentally is it spends money. And the city's influence is, to a very considerable extent, fundamentally all about how it both takes money from the public and how it allocates that money. And it is that spending authority. And in a very real way, policy intention in the city is not that important. It's not passion or rhetoric or where we try and lead. It's what we actually do. And what we actually do as a city, the expression of the values, is not rhetoric, it's not commentary, it's what we actually fund. So I think when we talk about this, it's not just a question of our public presentation, it's not just a question of whether or not city staff and city council feel that we are doing the right thing. It's really a question of, are we doing the right thing, and are we conducting our financial affairs in a way that is respectful and sustainable for future generations, and in a way that actually has the impacts that we are purporting to have. So I believe that the fundamental policy conversation about city finances is not some obscure academic contract, some issue associated with that. It is absolutely fundamental to the values of the municipal government and the values we purport to have. So I'm going to flip to the next slide, and I do want to emphasize that in a very fundamental way, the city is doing very, very well. And we pay KPMG, we pay Price Waterhouse, we don't pay The Economist, but we don't have to pay them for this stuff. We pay them to do work for us, but we do not pay them for their independent rankings, and there's kind of a core reality. We do really well in all of those rankings. The City of Toronto is a great place to live, play, invest, all of those other usual criteria, and we're seeing that in terms of the economics importance in the place and just the vitality of this city. The input, the influx of people, our ability to work together, it really is quite amazing, and this is a town that's booming. This is a great place at a great time, and public services are, my view, I have the privilege of being a senior public servant, my view, incredibly important to that. Public services are a fundamental piece, and right now we're seeing a situation in which, private investment is fantastic, but we're seeing two of the kind of core constraints we have. Our ability to function as a society with congestion is now going to be a function of our capacity to support public transit, and our ability to actually deal with things like poverty, carbon, a variety of other, is going to be a function of our ability to invest in public services. And those are things that are not going to be sorted out by the market. Those are things that are going to be sorted out by us collectively through the mechanisms of government, including an essential role for city government. So I do believe that we are a great city, we're doing great stuff, and we're making progress. And we can show that progress on the next slide. And it's just a silly little bubble chart, but all it really shows is, just take a look. I mean, we now have a transit plan. We have a transit plan endorsed by council. We're working our way through that. We're working our way through the mechanics of Smart Track. The somewhat arbitrary cuts of a number of years ago have been reinvested, have been replaced with the service reinvestment directed by council. We are, and I know not everybody will be comfortable about this, but we are relentlessly pursuing lower and more efficient costs through mechanisms like alternate service delivery. We are starting to make some progress. We're a very open government. We're starting to make some progress in terms of digital government and making sure we're available and able to serve people in a more modern way. There's a real estate review. We've gone through the process of the Toronto Community Housing Task Force and have some sense of how to put tenants first in our next model along those lines. So really, there is some fundamental change and energy, and I believe that council, the mayor, city staff are heading in generally the appropriate direction. If I can get to the next slide. But, and there's always a but, it's all about the money, because that's the policy intention, but we need to make sure that the resources align with the intention. Otherwise, the intention is not that meaningful. This is really, in the end, a financial contribution and a financial conversation. And as Shirley and Enid noted, I was here last year with a thought experiment, and it's a little bit of a small typeface, but it was fairly abstract, it was fairly high level, and it was fairly cautious. But what I walked through was basically, 4 or 5 basic points, one of which is that austerity has been the primary focus of the City of Toronto in a governance sense over the last number of years. And the government, when you make any kind of appropriate adjustment for inflation and per capita, is actually smaller than it was. So despite the increased demand for public services, government itself is a little bit smaller as a share of GDP, a little bit smaller as a share of family income, any kind of appropriate measure, government's a little bit smaller. What that's led to is this really big gap between expectations and funding. On the capital side, that's the $29 billion capital overhang we'll talk about. We have similar measures on the operating. Basically, there's a pretty big gap along those things. These are not news. These are long-standing and structural in nature. And as a result of that, while focused on the bottom line and austerity or expenditure control will be really important, there's no way we're going to address this. There's no way we're going to match our expectations with our spending capacity without some resort to revenue. That is a reality. And that has been, to be quite frank, consistent with what every city manager since amalgamation has said. This kind of theme is completely in the mainstream. It's supported by the work that Enid Slack and Andre Cote have done under the auspices of IMFG. There really has been no kind of pushback on that. There really is no sense that the finances of the City of Toronto are sustainable, or that the City of Toronto is able to meet the policy expectations of Council within their current fiscal envelope. Despite the lack of pushback, there is, I'm going to call it a little bit of complacency. There's a little bit of comfort. And that little bit of comfort is basically, well, it'll always work out. And I'm going to draw an analogy here because you know, smoking, doctors will bother people about smoking and suggest that maybe smoking isn't a good idea. And a lot of smokers certainly will have the idea, well, I'm still here. I was here last year, I'm here this year, then smoking is okay because it hasn't killed me dead. And the reality is, whether it's smoking or whether or not you live in BC and like to ski during avalanche terrain every winter, every day, you know, these things are risky behaviors and they might well catch up. And I am a public servant. As a public servant, I take risk with great seriousness. I advise that risk should be mitigated, managed, and minimal. And right now, we are very heavy smokers in the city of Toronto. And the sooner we quit, the sooner we step away, the sooner we restore that functionality. So my own personal view here, and I do mean this, is that we do need to have that dialogue around the sustainability of public finances, and it needs to be a realistic and direct dialogue. And well, you know, the statistical evidence is I smoked this year, I'm likely to be around next year. Yes, of course you're likely to be around. That's not really the test. The test, are you healthy? Are you sustainable? Is it wise? And is it appropriate management on behalf of the broader public of overall risk? I have a bias here. My own sense is that we should not have risky behavior. We should, in fact, as responsible leaders of public service and responsible leaders, begin to adjust our risk profile, minimize that risk, maximize our ability to not only make the investments we want to make today, but make them in the future, because it is those investments that give rise to the values and the impacts we purport to want to have. Now, the next slide is I talked about those things generally, and I talked about those things in order to generate this basic kind of challenge around a fiscal gap. And now I'm going to speak quite a bit more specifically about the fiscal gap, and then I'm going to talk quite a bit about some of the constraints on addressing that. And it's not just that there's a fiscal gap. There are three interrelated challenges. I'm going to spend a little bit on each of them in a few minutes. The first, starting from the upper left, is the one that people just generally immediately jump to, which is this gap between, you know, the long-term policy vision that Council has expressed, whether for capital or for operating or poverty or all of those things, and the actual funding level. And that's a gap, and I've been requested by Council to come up with a long-term financial plan to help address that gap. Secondly, there is a pretty obvious gap in terms of city building capital, and I'll show the $29 billion iceberg slide in a few minutes. And it doesn't really matter whether that number is exactly right or exactly wrong. There is no unquestionably, City Council has directed staff to work on many more projects that are essential to the city than we currently have the financial capital to fund. That needs to be addressed. So the first gap is basically operating in capital. We have an imbalance between our objectives and our resources. The second is that's absolutely true in terms of the capital envelope. And the third is a little bit crunchier, which is the gap for 17 and 18. And while I'm not going to have a big reveal here, there's not going to be, despite what Shirley said, some kind of beautiful equation that makes it all work. I am going to say that 17 is going to be a little bit challenging, and that some of the conversations we're going to end up having about revenue aren't just going to be around making the world better. They're not just going to be about making new investments. They're actually going to be about filling the gap between what council has endorsed and is doing now and the resources we actually have available to fund that. So the challenge with sustainability, like the challenge with smoking, is that it does hurt you, and we are probably over the time right now where we can reasonably kick the can down the road, and being unable to reasonably kick the can down the road, and I've been very clear in my advice to council in that regard, means we're going to have to address it. 17 and 18 are the years. They're not convenient years from an electoral cycle, but they are the years in which we are going to begin to direct that and have a dialogue about revenue, not only revenue as it applies to longer-term structural and more and better things, not only revenue as it might apply to our desire to actually give life to some of the capital suggestions that council has endorsed, but also just simply to maintain the existing level of services. Now, I'm going to walk through each of those challenges in a little bit more detail in a minute, but before I do that, I actually need to speak a little bit about kind of three core things that I need to draw attention to. And basically explain, in my view, some of the limitations associated with austerity, revenue, and assuming our way out of the problem. In the old economist joke, assuming a ladder. So I'm going to walk through each of these, and then I'm going to return back to not that bubble diagram, but each of the sequences associated with that. So I'm going to talk briefly about austerity, revenue, and assumptions, basically to talk in a practical sense about the constraints or the limits available to City Council and to City staff as we begin to explore the dilemmas associated with long-term sustainability, capital investment, and in my view, the actual realization of a balanced budget for 17 and 18. So next slide, please. So austerity is important, and I say this with some pride. I am not a city manager who is afraid of constraint. I think constraint is something that is part of any successful toolkit. I've had the opportunity to work for all political parties who have led the government of Ontario, and I can tell you that all of them have a relentless focus on making sure we get the best value for the dollar. All of them have a Treasury board that asks great questions. All of them have a focus on that. I think it is entirely appropriate that we continue to explore all of the measures, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, to ensure that tax and ratepayers realize the best value for their investment. However, and I'm going to say, in reality, I think the City of Toronto has done a great job about that, and I apologize for the complexity of the slide, but you can see that the orange bar is the opening pressure that the City of Toronto shows every year. The blue bar is basically the contribution of savings towards addressing that pressure, and the gray bar is the extent to which savings have been explaining away that pressure. And really what I want to say is, you see this little bar right here? That's basically at $200 million. And last year, City of Toronto saved $200 million. That's a real number. Like, I'm proud of that. I'm proud of our system's ability to consistently save money over a period of time. And that's crunchy. That's hard. That means things like gapping, which is another way of saying not filling all of your positions, and a variety of things like that. As somebody who is responsible for trying to deliver value for money on behalf of the tax and the rate base, I'm fairly comfortable with that narrative, with that approach. But that's not enough. And there is another thing we need to acknowledge, which is that we've now had 6 years of austerity focus. Whatever is left in 17 and 18 is something that escaped the 4 years of Ford, the first year of Tory, and now my second year as city manager. It's getting increasingly hard to rely on savings, and even during the peak era of Ford, when we made savings that were clearly unacceptable to council, because it reversed itself on those at the earliest opportunities, we were not able to get savings that actually offset the overall growth in the size of the funding envelope. So, savings, austerity, absolutely a critical tool, not sufficient. Absolutely not sufficient. So it's a great tool, but it is not the crutch. It's not the way that's going to get out of this. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about revenue. Now, I think in many respects the revenue conversation is buoyant. I think that we are tending to think about revenue as something that's going to buy us new stuff. We absolutely need to think about that as well, but it's also revenue in order to sustain our current level of service. And the City of Toronto does not have an enormous number of revenue options, and I actually want to spend a minute on this slide and walk through it a little bit more slowly. My view is that the City of Toronto has basically three kind of core sources of revenue. The first is taxes on real property, of which the most basic is, of course, property tax. And then property tax has a couple of different classes: residential, commercial, etc. And then we also have land transfer tax, which is at its root a tax on property. And we might be able to implement, for example, a parking levy, which is, by the time you get down to it, only a narrower tax on property. It just happens to be a tax on the piece of property that happens to be paved and available for parking. But it is still a tax on property. So basically, of the city's revenue base, the vast majority of it, statistically, is made up of taxes on real property. That mix has changed, with council consistently directing very low increases in residential property tax and having the great fortune to experience a very, very high increases in land transfer tax. But that's not something conceptually different. That's all just tax on property. Next bar over is the City of Toronto Act does give us, and CODA is a code name for the City of Toronto Act, I apologize for the acronym, does give us some tools that are unique, and essentially these are indirect taxes. And those of you who follow Enid or anybody else know full well that cities lack the capacity to do indirect taxes. There are a few exceptions to that. And we can piggyback on the province's indirect tax on personal vehicles. The province has given us, at least in theory, access to an alcohol tax, a tobacco tax, and an amusement tax. These taxes are superficially attractive, but when you actually go through the mechanics of them, for example, a tax on alcohol really only makes sense if we can collect it at the LCBO, and the LCBO may not be all that interested in collecting a tax on behalf of the City of Toronto for all sorts of reasons that make sense from the LCBO perspective. So as we work through these have the appearance of being powerful tools, but when you actually look at them, many of them are considerably less attractive. And then finally, we have user fees, and these aren't new. Basically, we have, the TTC, and you guys are familiar, I think many of you, with the reality that TTC has been a relatively large share of our increase in revenue over a period of time. TTC fares have been. We can collect. We can put a gate on something. We can put a gate on a community center. We can put we can take those people who are regulated and charge them for the privilege of being regulated. Similarly, we can charge building permits as we do. We can do those kinds of things. We already have solid waste fees, and of course, we can do full cost pricing of public goods, and effectively that means road pricing and tolls. I'll speak to that again in a minute. But that's basically the full set of tools we have. And these tools are not tools available to us, and especially if we look at 17 and 18. I have to be able to present a budget that balances in the current year. I can't rely on any of these aspirational tools. I can't rely on tools that I don't know work. I can't make an assumption that we can get an alcohol tax unless I actually know that. So when it actually comes down to the nitty-gritty mechanics of budget making, our flexibility is not that great. And it comes down to a fairly specific set of tools that we know and we have right now. And we have traditionally been reluctant to raise revenue from those tools. So that's a little bit challenging. I want to speak, though, to the bottom half of the slide. So these are the decision criteria. And I had a glorious year teaching in the academy, and I spent a lot of time doing microeconomics and public finance and stuff like that in university. And I know that in order to make the decision about which type of these taxes, not revenue tools, not some other language, which type of these taxes or fees we should use some criteria. They should be available and feasible. We should rank them by the amount of money they could do. We should understand what their timing is, their stability. We shouldn't take an undue risk. We really want to make sure that they minimize economic distortion. We really don't want to impose ridiculously high compliance costs on payers, which is what happens, for example, when you do a parking levy. We want to make sure that these are acceptable administrative costs. All of those other criteria, like minimize unintended consequences, all sensible. But really, what matters is that bottom one, which is political acceptance. Now, many of you in the room are working in an academic setting. I no longer have the great luxury of doing that, and I'm working for a council that is exceptionally reluctant to use one of those tools, and that is an increase in residential property tax, particularly an increase of residential property tax to the level that might be necessary to close a significant gap in 17 and 18. And that is a reality. That is a reality. That is my reality. That is the public policy reality, and it is something that I work within. So recommending the unacceptable is not a great way for a public servant to make a living. So I need to work around a council that has given me some fairly specific operating instructions, and I will be working within those over a period of time. But there is a core reality that for its entire history, the City Council of the amalgamated City of Toronto has placed a very high priority on low property taxes, and that's likely to continue over the next little while. So as I work my way through the next set of slides about the kinds of steps we need to take, there will not be a big emphasis on raising residential property taxes. That's not on the table in the near future. It will be around some of the other mechanisms. And I say that because that is the world I work in, that is the council I serve, that is the basic direction. The next slide I want to speak to is equally unpleasant, and it is around assumptions and narrative. And basically, you know, these are all the get out of jail card frees, the get out of jail free cards. And yeah, the province owes us that money, therefore the province should buy us that new whatever. It's not going to happen. Like, it's just not going to happen. The province is dead flat broke. Forget it. Not going to happen. You know, MLTT, it's a great tax, but we are tied to the real estate market, and there's some risk associated with that. You know, here's the thing. The reality is that we have tended to rely on a narrative of we'll just push that out. That works until a point where you hit an inflection point. The definition of unsustainability is we hit an inflection point. My own view is that looks a little bit like, it actually looked a little bit like last year, but a lot more like that for 17 and 18. And really, truly, you know, the idea that we have a capital problem and we are expecting that marvelous alignment with the Government of Canada, the City of Toronto, and the Province of Ontario to help us with the capital, for sure, we'll get some money out of that. But no other government has expressed the slightest interest in helping the City of Toronto with its operating challenge. And its operating challenge is the one I'm going to focus on in a couple of minutes. So basically, as I walk through this, I want us to understand that there are some constraints around this. And we can't assume an answer. We can't assume a new revenue measure that doesn't exist. And we certainly can't assume that we're going to cut our way out of this problem, because none of those have the benefit of being true. And as we put together a 17 and 18 budget, we actually have to rely on stuff that we can reasonably believe is true and will actually, in fact, happen. That's the basic core criteria. So now I'm going to walk through the last two slides relatively quickly, but I do want to emphasize something here, which is the mayor and I are aligned on this. And you can see I'm not going to read through it, but you can see a recent speech from the mayor in which indicates clearly that he understands the issues of sustainability as they relate to both operating and capital, and he's committed to moving forward on those things. So we will be working to move that forward and working with council in that regard. Next slide, please. So I now want to talk through those three basic challenges. And you remember the first one on the upper left was on the bubble chart, the overlapping Venn diagram chart was long-term financial framework. And, you know, at this time last year, I was kind of hoping I'd be coming back this year talking about the long-term financial framework. I kind of hoped, I actually felt that I would be here talking about the glorious stuff we were going to do and the model. I'm not there yet. We actually got to deal with 17 and 18, and I'll come back to that in a sec. But here's basically, you know, what we're looking for. And the good news is, I know this is the same good news Joe gave. It's true, it's absolutely true, that we're fundamentally stable in terms of traditional municipal services, direct services to property. We can fund those off the property tax. We are really, truly struggling with the demands of density, and particularly the transit associated with that. And we're struggling with the demands of poverty, social cohesion, and all of those other things. And we are actually ending up in a situation we are transmitting risk across generations and across certain classes of people that we do not want to translate risk. And we are not, as a city, we do not have the funding tools available to deal with that. Had we actually raised property tax each and every year at the rate of economic growth, we might actually have that capacity. We didn't, we don't. You know, It's a gap, and we're going to have to address it. And at this point, I think a fundamental question associated with a long-term plan is, what kind of city do we want? And what do we want? Do we want to actually make ourselves smaller as a city? Do we want to step away from those priorities, or do we want to invest in those priorities? Council has always answered yes. It wants to invest in those priorities. It just has not yet provided the funding mechanism to do that. And the asymmetry in the council agendas, and if you look on a week-by-week basis, there is, these enormous numbers of material, each of which looks to make government do more, and then once or twice a year we have a conversation about making government smaller. That's a gap we need to close. I would prefer to be in front of you right now talking about that plan. We're not there yet. There's a consultation process that starts on this in the next couple of weeks. I encourage you and other members of civic society to participate. But basically, here's what we're going to do. We are going to have a relentless drive on the bottom towards cost efficiency, towards contestability, towards things like alternate service delivery. And, actually, as a senior public servant, I am going to say there is some merit in the race to the bottom. We will look always to find the most efficient way to do things. Sometimes there will be social and employment consequences of that. That is a consistent approach over a period of time. We'll continue to do that. I was able to do that in the Government of Ontario as Deputy of Finance, Secretary of Treasury Board, all of those other things. That won't get us there. That will not get us there, and we are going to have to look at revenue. And on the revenue side, we will either need to find an annual substantial increase in property tax, not yet acceptable to council, new revenue tools that generate significant money each and every year, not yet acceptable to council, or some other deal with another order of government that will fill in our operating, not something yet acceptable to those other orders of government. So there's a challenge here, and we'll be back to address that. I wish this was the big reveal. I wish I was solving that, but I'm not. Next slide is the city building capital, and I actually feel quite a bit more confident about this, and this is the $29 billion gap. Another number was mentioned earlier. We can come up with different ways of cutting this, really no matter what. Over the next 10 years, City Council has directed a very large number of projects that are systemically, and structurally important to the City of Toronto that have not yet been financed. We need to fill that gap. We're not going to fill that gap with cuts to the operating. We're going to fill that gap with measures that are new revenues. And that could include a dedicated property tax, and the Mayor has already indicated its support for a city building fund with a 0.5% increase of property tax. Full cost utility pricing, and since we already are close to full cost pricing on water, that means garbage and a few other things as the last piece. Road pricing may be in the mix there. That's supposed to say something a little bit less ambiguous than that, and a little bit more ambiguous than that. Parking levy might also be something that we could put into that, and of course proceeds from asset recycling. So these are the types of mechanisms, if we are going to fund the long-term capital issue, these are the types of things that might reasonably be brought forward as part of that. And again, I wish I was solving that problem, but we're not there yet. We actually have to work through the next problem, which is 17 and 18. And as in every year, we identify for council at the beginning of the cycle the significant pressure. This year it was 607 with a smaller number, 438 associated with 2018. That 2018 number will rise. That's the 2017 cost of delivering the 2016 level of service, and the issues, basically agencies and city staff saying that if you want everything to be exactly the same, you need to give me $600 million. That's a big chunk of money. That's not actually a completely realistic number, but it's a good indication of that. Council looked at that. Obviously, that's unacceptable. The math doesn't work out. We're not going to raise property taxes by anywhere near that amount. So, we have an objective here of holding property taxes at the rate of inflation. So, residential property tax at the rate of inflation. So, in order to get there, the arithmetic works out. We need about a 2.6% reduction across the board in all of the city programs. You guys have seen the language that's come out of the TTC and others. It's pretty clear from an agency perspective, and it's also clear from a division perspective, that the ability to realize all of that is not yet there. So, this is a conversation we'll be bringing forward to council in November, just before and just as part of the December 2nd operating budget, preliminary budget process. But this is not something that will automatically solve itself. And my own personal view, and I've been crystal clear about this, is that the opportunity to take further measures that simply kick the can down the road is neither appropriate nor is it necessarily available. So we will need to work our way through what might be a little bit of a crunchy 2017 or not 2018 budget process. And while we've had this idea in general about raising revenue and devoting it to things, and we should talk about the revenue requirements for our investments in poverty, we should talk about the revenue requirements for our investment in transit and other capital and all those other things, we may also this year need to have a little bit of a dialogue about our revenue requirements in order to meet a gap in 17 and 18 and make that forward on a sustainable basis. So I'm going to just show one little slide, and it's kind of a funny little equation, but here's what it is. And it's basically, the sustainability, big gap up there at 607 or whatever the number actually is. We're going to try and get some expenditure management to solve that. Whatever we can't solve through expenditure management, we're going to need to deal with on the revenue side. I'm not 100% sure that that's going to work out all that well. It's not worked out all that well so far, so we may need to find, as a practical matter, some bridging measures, some interim solutions. But those bridging measures shouldn't put pressure on us back in 2018. We're going to have to figure out very quickly a way in which we make the fiscal plan whole. So the goal is zero pressure. We need to do that for 17 and 18. That'll be an interesting dialogue, and I want to show one last slide just to emphasize how interesting it will be. And I apologize for the small print here, but we're in front of Executive Committee on the transit plan, and particularly Smart Track, as early as the 26th of this month. The rate-supported budget launch is coming right up on November the 4th or so. We have the long-term financial plan, or at least an interim cut at it, if I can get that done, on December the 1st. That will also include a revenue report, and we will have a revenue report regardless at that point in time. Then we have, of course, council report on revenue and assets and a variety of other things. All have been directed. So that actually happens within the next 6 or 7 weeks. All of this needs to come forward. It'll be a really interesting ride that leads us into the new year and hopefully a more stable long-term financial plan. I appreciate your forbearance. I know I talked for a little bit longer than the requisite 20 minutes. It's a long, complicated topic, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
You still enjoying yourself?
I am. No, I love public finance. I have maybe a little bit of a sick sense of humor. Yeah.
Well, I see a number of counselors in the room, which I think it's great to see. I see Anna Davis, Gordon Perk, and Shirley Carroll. Anybody else? I haven't seen. Welcome. I'm sure we're going to have a very good conversation. I think Peter has given us a lot to think about. I said to Peter when he showed me his thinking, the slides that we just saw over the weekend. And as you have seen, he's taking a very different approach than what you saw before in terms of kind of more of a budget presentation that Joe gave us, I think, in the last few times that he's done it. So gave us a sense of where we've been and where we're going. And I would say Joe's presentation focused more kind of from year to year. What are we, where is the city going? Much more incremental. What I'm seeing with Peter's approach is we've done the incremental now 18 years. 2 more years will be 20 years since amalgamation. And I am hoping with the kind of thinking that and the challenge that Peter's put out there, not just for the mayor and council, but I think indeed for all of us as Torontonians, how are we going to solve both the short-term and the long-term operating and capital needs of this city? And I think we are at that point now where we need to really figure out how do you do both at the same time? Because I thought your last slide, there are 2 slides in particular in his deck that I think helps us to think through this. Slide 6, where you have the 3, circles in terms of the short-term and long-term challenges. And this last slide, in terms of the whole question about what has been the bridging solutions. We have done the bridging solutions for 18 years, right? And every year, and rating reserves is part of that bridging solution that council has had to do in order to make sure there's no service disruption and the more critical municipal services continue in the city. So I want to kick off the conversation, and I'm sure, knowing the people in this room, there'll be lots of questions and comments for Peter, so I want to make sure we have enough time for that. The three areas I want Peter to comment on. The first one is really, what are, from your point of view, especially from what you've seen at the province, what you're seeing now at the municipal level, and I like the way he describes it. When I ask him after a month in the job, how do you find it, the difference in the province and the city? He says, well, it's very granular and gritty at the city. I said, well, service delivery tends to be, right? It's right there, and people will be right at you if they don't have that. So I'd like you to comment on, in order to be successful in focusing, getting the mayor and council to look at working on both the long-term objectives that they have set, and they have set a number of key objectives that are truly city-building objectives, same time also dealing with the short-term challenges like getting a balanced 2017-18 budget. What are those key ingredients?
So I do struggle with that a little bit, and I think I do want to emphasize a core difference between the province and the city, and it's not public service. Public service is public service, and it's not intent. They are both marvelous places to work, and places that I've had the marvelous privilege of being in a leadership role. The province actually has, in my view, a genuinely serious financial situation. It really is run itself out of credit capacity to a considerable extent, and it is something where the risks have been absorbed over a period of time. What the city needs to do, it's been smoking for a long time, but it needs to manage that risk more appropriately. And I don't think that is all that difficult. I think that it's difficult if we insist on exactly the same behaviors, and our challenge is to say no to everything, no to all of the tools that might be available to us. But I think if we do actually get a little bit more flexible and are willing to take some risks, and the timing's not great for council, but if we are willing to take some risks, willing to be very transparent and clear about the value and need to price public services appropriately, and making sure that people understand that we are investing their money appropriately and in a good way, I think we can get there. And I think the policy permission available from the public in a very popular mayor, all of those other things, I think that room and that flexibility actually exists. I think the province is a little bit more challenged that way. So I do have concerns about some aspects of the provincial economic and kind of fiscal context. I think the city itself is actually in the point where it now just needs to understand that the risk is the risk, and certainly my advice as a public servant is to manage that earlier, and I think we are in the situation that the province might have been a few years ago. The other thing I'll say is that I have, when I talk about risk, it should be clear that I was the Deputy Minister of Finance in 2008, and risks that are abstract can become real in a very short period of time. And you wish that we had addressed them before. And I think this is a golden opportunity for the city, in a relatively structured and relatively straightforward way, to take a thoughtful approach to, my technical language, risk mitigation, more colloquial language, to matching the benefits and costs of the services. And I think that is a glorious opportunity. We need to walk council through that in a practical way, because council has not, council has had the relatively straightforward opportunity over the last little while of deferring. And just as an example, when the province of Ontario somewhat arbitrarily cut Toronto pooling compensation, what the city did was to basically defer that and borrow from itself, and that bill comes forward in 2017. Okay, now we have to pay it. So, this is the kind of thing where we're running out of that room. It's better not to wait till, you're looking at the radiology, let's quit sooner let's begin to make some progress right now. And I think we have a mayor and hopefully a council that will begin to help to nudge us in that direction.
Well, I think it leads to a second question I have, and it is what some writers have talked about as the implementation gap of public service. It's not just at the city level, but it's also provincial or federal level. And this is the issue that's also related kind of public trust and public confidence. So every time we announce, whether it's a new initiative or a new way to fund, the headline comes up, overspent, deadline not met, millions overspent, projects can't be completed. And I'm not picking on TDC, but TDC has been in the headlines as a major issue in regard to that. Can you talk a bit about how, as a city manager, can deal with this issue of implementation gap, just not implement it well, not able to deliver well, so that it erodes that public trust and public confidence in whatever city council approves and direct the public service to do?
And I think that is a fair enough question, and I think we need to be careful in our characterization because there are many projects that are delivered on time or on budget, in fact, quicker and under budget. And those are probably the majority of experience, but I understand and fully accept that there are a handful of high-level projects, and particularly the larger ones, with very significant cost overruns. The cost overruns are a function of very often two things. Cost underestimation in the first place, and we have to, as public servants, be infinitely more disciplined and not do what public servants frequently do, which is to underprice something so council will approve it and then deal with the consequences later. We need to actually, do what the province has gotten much, much better at, which is providing discipline. And then secondly, we have to provide discipline around project management and be much clearer about the overall framing and those kinds of things. So that mechanism can be done through through P3s. It can be done through another mechanism, other mechanisms as well. But we do need to have a practice of discipline in terms of the price points we announce, and we need to be very disciplined in terms of the way in which we conduct and implement the projects. But there is kind of something that's very challenging about the City of Toronto, and I'm happy to speak about it, but it is also a little bit tricky because the city has not actually invested hugely in its administrative self. And the city management, it does not actually have the tools that are available to it in the federal government or in the government of Ontario. And I can speak with great practicality in terms of this, that management in the City of Toronto spends a great deal of its time being responsive to council and to councillors, but it has not fundamentally had the opportunity to invest in the underlying information technology. It has not had the opportunity to invest particularly in a reform agenda. So I'll be working with council to get permission to bring forward a chief transformation officer and other mechanisms. But there is kind of a, from my perspective, a core reality here that the city has not been able to transform itself into a mature, more efficient operating entity because, ironically, it's been counting every penny. It has not had the opportunity to take the little bit of risk you need to take on IT projects that actually build a core management information system. So, when we go to, when we go to put on a new module, for example, we need to I signed attendance slips. I sign attendance slips. I should never be signing attendance slips. Okay, so I go yell at somebody, why the hell am I signing attendance slips? What's the matter with you people? We're an SAP system. Why aren't you just turning on the SAP module? Okay, the answer is because we never updated SAP, and we're dealing with a really old SAP, so in order to do that, we need a whole bunch of investment to either upgrade SAP or to modify the existing SAP model so it'll work retrospectively because we never updated our damn phone. So, there's this basic problem where the city has just not invested in management capacity. Management capacity is not a big seller from a council perspective, and until we get that core competence of capital management, and part of the reason that TTC has a problem is that TTC is managing on a shoestring. And it's really hard to look good when you're managing on a shoestring. And that, I've had an opportunity to work in the province. I think I can tell you that there's a difference there.
Related to the TDC and TCHC. TCHC, there has been a major study done on TCHC. And TDC, there's always been a lot of discussion about what about a different structure for TDC, splitting the capital function from the operating. And especially now with Metrolinx also, being a very key partner in a number of the capital projects. Can you just talk generally about whether, in terms of, better more effective implementation, looking at a major function like the social housing area and public transit, that a completely different structural reform for delivery may be possible?
So that is a possibility, and it's undoubtedly worth looking at. And we have major projects in the city. We have major projects in the TTC. We also have a series of questions about the organization of Toronto community housing. The one thing I want to be very cautious about is directing all of our energy into questions of organizational design, because the organizational design and the delivery models might be part of the problem, but that capital overhang, whatever it is not fundamentally a function of organizational design. It's fundamentally a function of many necessary city building projects to which we have not allocated adequate resources, that we have assumed be built, but have not yet put in place resources to allow them to actually be built. So of course we should look at organizational structure, and of course we should stress test, and of course we should be fearless with respect to the existing organizational boundaries, and every once in a while we do have to smash things and put them up, and there's no conceivable way that the organization of how real estate is dealt with in the City of Toronto makes any sense at all. So we do have to be fearless about pulling those things apart and reassembling them in a way. But that is around progress and administrative capacity and policy and operationalization. The core challenges we have related to the gaps, if it were a gap of a few $1 million, then that's a beautiful solution to that problem. But our problems are probably a little bit bigger. They're systemic, they're 17 years old, they're structural in nature. And we do need to look at models, and we do need to look at there are better ways of organizing our delivery of capital, our delivery of operating, our relationship with the social housing sector, a variety of things like that. But those are not panaceas, those are tools. And I want to make sure that we do not, in an organization that is fairly marginal in terms of its capacity to deliver, in many respects, fairly tired, doesn't spend all of its time chasing its organizational tail and just kind of disappear as it does that. So I do believe fundamentally in organizational change, but I think an organization, shouldn't just assume that its problem is only that it's badly organized. Its problem is fundamentally about the allocation of resource. Once we have the resource, we do need to organize that as efficiently as possible, and that does require change, but it's not the only issue.
So we're going to open it up now. It's your turn. If you could use a mic, introduce yourself, and then ask your question or make your comment, whatever you like to do. So I have one here. Is there? Yes.
I'm François Vaillancourt from Université de Montréal. Could your talk not have been what we do to you is what we don't fund? In the following two senses. You chose in the first paragraph not to talk about regulation, but that imposes spending on units. I always smile at the Toronto practice of having people shovel their sidewalk themselves, right? Like the city do it, unless you're called in the army. But the more important issue in your debate, I don't know if you have any evidence on the importance of the regulatory costs, but what we don't do, okay, is what we force you to fund. If all these deficit in capital spending lead, for example, to take the TTC to a longer transit of 15 minutes on average per day for 500,000 people, what is the economic cost to the city of that? And what kind of argument could you use along those lines to convince council to raise taxes or spend better?
So it's a really good point, and it would be great if I were back teaching. Because you are exactly right. The way the city organizes itself, the city does socialize private costs. And the costs we don't socialize rise in terms of private costs. And right now, we actually don't do, I think, a bad job with downtowners clearing, their sidewalks. It actually works fairly well to privatize that and to have that risk taken on. And then we do actually regulate that, because we'll put it under your property taxes if you don't clear the snow, and if you're infirm, we'll clear it for you. So I think we have not a bad mix in that regard. But in terms of the broader point, there is no doubt that our inability to appropriately socialize, to use the technical term, a lot of costs, and particularly the cost of congestion, means that cost of congestion is borne by individuals in terms of gridlock, commute times, horrible transfers on the TTC, short turns on streetcars, and I think the absence of adequate investment in, for example, things like housing are really showing up in terms of the private costs borne by individuals in poverty, and then they show up later in terms of the public costs borne by the school system or others as we try and sort through the risks associated with children who are not adequately housed. So I do believe that there's a holistic equation and something that's there. That is work, unfortunately, I'm going to delegate to you in the academy, because that is not something that is a powerful argument. It might help, but it's not incredibly straightforward to use in a city building, in a city budgetary context, which is, I used the word earlier, and it was faithfully reported, quite granular and quite specific. And really what we need to be able to show is a very clear link between, if you do this, this will happen kind of right away. It's a great question.
Got one back there and one in front here.
Hello, my name is Astra Burka, and I'm an architect. And going to Shirley's point about cost overruns and cost estimations and project management. As an architect, I'm embarrassed how the city has got so many projects, 100 million over project at Union Station, 40 million at City Hall, 400 million with the subway, you know, and it just goes on and on and on and on to York University. And I'm thinking, and I was talking with Chris Hume the other day, and why don't we, when we budget, at least when you're getting a price, take away, like they do in England, the lowest and the highest bids, and then look at the three middle ones and see who's the best person for the job. What we're doing is, we just saw it with College Street Promenade. A developer or contractor, you know, does two jobs, and they didn't, and they had cost overruns, and now he's hired for a third job. And to me, that is poor administration. And I'm really finding that the project management part of the city could be doing a better job by actually de-bureaucratizing the situation, making it simple and saying who's the best person for the job, not who's the cheapest. And because we suffer from that all the time. And I agree we have to take more risks. So, you know, I like that attitude, but I think with project management, we've got to start picking the right teams to do the jobs in the city.
So I appreciate the question, and it is a good question. And there is no doubt that the City of Toronto and its agency need to improve their capacity for project management. Province of Ontario, through the vehicle of Infrastructure Ontario, has actually been able to bring much more discipline. It's been able to bring much more discipline to the cost estimation, the appropriate cost escalation, and much more discipline to the management of the contracts. One of the basic differences, though, is that those contracts cost a lot more in the starting point. So you know, oftentimes our issue is that we've underestimated the cost. The cost was always going to be the number plus $100 million. We just didn't actually accurately estimate it in the first place. The other thing is that I will acknowledge that as the Ontario Deputy Minister of Finance, I had the great joy of dealing with a couple of different, actually both as Associate Cabinet Secretary, with Stelco, General Motors, and Chrysler, and watching those companies in real difficulty. And I can give you an absolute assurance that cost underestimation and risk management is not only a risk in the public sector, and that the very biggest private sector companies can make enormous mistakes. So we do make mistakes. We do need to do better, but these are not exclusively the province of the municipality. In terms of the simple mechanics of throwing in out or out bids, that will work on small projects, but on many of these big projects, it's not so straightforward. And remember that we deal with things remember that government deals with things that by their very nature are socializing broader risk. And something like Union Station is not really financeable by private sector capital because it's not profit-making to begin with, and when you go through it, you have no idea what's going to happen when you open up those walls. It's not surprising that those things happen. So I agree with you, but I also have, I don't want to say tolerance, because I don't have tolerance for cost overruns, but I do think we need to be sophisticated in terms of our understanding of our capacity to deliver zero risk. I think we do have to acknowledge that capital projects do run over in public and private sectors, and that's a reality. We can ask Bombardier.
Got a question in the front row here.
I'm resorting to cheap shots already in the evening. That's not a good sign.
I'm Robert Ebo from the District of Columbia in the United States. Going to the revenue issue, and I think going to risk management as well. How often do you do revenue estimates? As city manager, are you able to say that is the hard budget constraint? And when you do so, can you do that over a certain financial plan? For example, in DC, the city manager, CFO, does quarterly revenue estimates. It is a hard budget constraint. The council cannot go beyond that. And it's a 4-year financial plan. And if that 4-year plan is not balanced, the city manager steps in and says, you are going to cut this.
So here's where I'm going to be directly critical of the current process in the city. The city has a 1-year plan with a 1-year outlook, and that's all. There is no forward guidance. I've been talking about how council, does not make decisions that fit it into its budget constraint. That's because it has never provided itself with a budget constraint. It's provided itself with an aspirational sense of a plan, which is just basically thou shalt be a good person. But there is no 4-year or 5-year or 3-year string of numbers going out. So there is no budget constraint. There is no practical estimate of the amount of fiscal room available. We have a 10-year capital plan, but we have nothing on the operating that brings that into focus. I would prefer to be bringing that forward this year. The reality is we've spent all of our time trying to manage over the course of the summer and early fall. We have not been in a position to do that. So to answer your question in a direct practical sense, council does approve. It actually, in a practical sense, what it does is it starts with the revenue constraint. It actually does 2 contradictory things, to be very frank. It starts with a service constraint, and it proves a bunch of services, and it says, you bureaucracy go off and deliver those services. And then most of the way into partway into the fiscal year, it then comes up with a budget constraint, and it drives that budget constraint off of its property tax, and then hands the mess over to us to deliver in the course of that fiscal year, and only that fiscal year. And then we start the cycle again, and we wonder why it is we can never get in front of it. And the answer is because we are driving down a very dark dirt road with only our parking lights on, and we need to have a better conversation about illuminating the way and providing some guidance for council and making a little bit more sophisticated, mature conversations. So we have a $12 billion operating budget and a multi-billion-dollar capital plan in the 6th largest government in the country, and it's done on the basis of 1-year cycles, and it can't even approve that 1-year cycle until it's the better part of a couple months through the fiscal year. So there is room for process improvement, I say, without fear of much contradiction.
Other comments, questions? Back. Richard.
Thank you, Richard Joy. Just a very quick question. You'd mentioned that had the city raised its, I assume, residential and then all the other property tax rates fall under, at the rate of economic growth, we wouldn't have the problem that we're facing today. I'm assuming you're going back to, say, amalgamation as a starting point. What would be, not expecting it could ever happen politically, but theoretically, what would be the jump up that we would have to get to in 1 year for foregoing the retroactive, but just to catch up to what that tax rate might have been, and roughly what is the revenue delta?
I do apologize, Richard, but I don't have that number off the top of my head. It is a couple $1 billion or whatever the number is. That would give us a good start, but even then that might be fairly challenging. And just one of the things is I have it loaded in the slide deck, but there is a basic structural challenge with the City of Toronto, which is that property taxes are really very well suited to deal with things that residents feel directly, like services to property. They're much less attractive in terms of dealing with redistribution aspects like social housing, or to some extent like massive investments in new transit. And part of it's just simply the visibility and political attractiveness of holding property taxes low. So I think I'm only going to speak for myself, not for others, but as a public servant, I need to be realistic about the expectations I have with council. And as much as I'd like them to follow the core and best advice coming from somebody who spent a lot of time doing macroeconomics in the 70s and learned those lessons as much as I could. Professor Bird and others, please, I tried. I have to be realistic and about the amount of flex that actually gives us. That's more a way of saying actually how much it would have taken, and really we're not going to recapture that. That's done and over, and the conversation needs to start again about the appropriate and acceptable mix of taxes. And one of the basic and fundamental challenges, to be slightly too concrete, is that property taxes are highly visible and highly transparent. And that's a really good thing in public finance terms, but it means that in terms of funding a growing city, it can be fairly challenging.
Can I follow up on I guess, where Joe Panichetti's presentation left off, Peter, about dealing with social housing and public transit funding, maybe in a different way? Would that help with looking at different way of funding
As the
core
province sneaks
municipal
out? As the
services?
province sneaks out? I'm going to pay for that. It would. And I'm very impatient with our own inability to come to grips with these things, and should be more gracious about that and careful about my expectations. But I think that underlying this, there is a genuine challenge here, which is that the City of Toronto is working on basically the same basis as every other municipality, with the exception of a handful of fairly narrow indirect taxes, which in and of themselves are fairly difficult to operate. And I think we are big enough and important enough that the governments of Canada and Ontario should think considerably about the burden, the disproportionate burden of poverty in the city, the disproportionate burden of the transit friction. These are things that I think have GDP levels of impact, real impacts on individuals and families. I think they are risks that are social risks that I think are unacceptable, and I think to have them, put down exclusively on the city is important. It is not tolerable, and it's wrong. Where I am very concerned, though, and I need to be direct and clear about this, where I am very concerned is if we make assumptions as a city that in the immediate future we can rely on our historic sense of grievance and expect that the province or the government of Canada will bail us out. We've had the same situation with social housing now for a decade and a half or a little bit more than that. Like the current city council policy towards social housing is we want to cut it by 2.6%, right? Now that will change as we go through, but that is the kind of instructions we have. So we are going to have to adjust that in the near future. So I'm quite impatient that we tend to hide behind the narrative of it's somebody else's fault. Having acknowledged that, we will need to work with Ontario and Canada to find a better, more sustainable way to finance what are vital public services, particularly transit and housing.
Got two questions here in the second row. Oh, we got one back there too. Okay. Anthony.
So picking up on your comment about alternative service delivery and...
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Oh, Anthony Fernando. Thank you very much. Just picking up your comment on alternative service delivery and considering that so much of the city's costs are wrapped up in the collective agreements with its strong civil service, and also thinking about the interim report regarding the future of policing, could you comment a little bit about where has alternative service delivery been successful? What are some candidates? And also considering the fact that a lot of these public sector unions are very politically active.
So I was the Assistant Deputy Minister and Director of Program Management and Expenditure during the time in which Mike Harris arrived at the Government of Ontario. Was very active in the process of outsourcing, and I will say by and large that has been a successful experiment for the Province of Ontario, and many of the things that were successfully outsourced have remained out, and we remain relatively comfortable with that from a policy perspective, and a number of years later those have not been reversed or brought back in. So I am comfortable with outsourcing as a broad broad policy construct and comfortable with alternate service delivery. I think we have to be exceedingly careful about how it works in practice. And it does require that we have a robust market in which to outsource those services, and we do not become dependent on a small number of suppliers, which can happen and can very easily happen to municipal governments. So the notion of maintaining and enhancing competitive tension is something that I'm very much on side with, but the practicalities of securing that is very challenging. And I'm going to speak frankly here. You know, there is really few private sector markets that are more robust than automotive. And City Council recently approved an initiative to outsource a number of the vehicle fleet maintenance aspects into the private sector. That was something that City Council struggled with, not only traditional left-wing or center-left councillors, but some of the others as well. So that, you know, that is, it's not as straightforward from a policy or an operational standpoint. And to be very clear, it's not something that generates immediate savings. And one of those challenges that happened in the government of Ontario, to be very frank, is that sometimes costs went up because when you actually build in the actual performance requirements, sometimes the public sector hasn't been meeting them because of gapping or, you know, the way it's been doing things. When you actually request somebody to actually deliver that, it turns out that the costs rise a little bit just simply because we're actually expecting somebody to deliver the service. You know, to be quite frank, we're not going to find a private sector company who's going to deliver the same level of service in our shelters that we deliver. And I think we need to be cautious about assuming that outsourcing is a panacea. Having said that, you saw my proud slide saying the relentless race to the bottom. That will be a tool, and I will recommend that we continue to focus on outsourcing and alternate service delivery when it makes economic sense, when we're confident as public servants, when we're confident as stewards of public resources that we actually have a situation in which it makes business sense, not only for the first round, but for the round that does that. I will say one other thing, that the City of Toronto does not have a stellar record in terms of its management of contracts. And that one of the challenges we have is we do not have the underlying sophistication, audit, internal audit, risk management, or other frameworks that will allow us to make certain that we deliver and get value from the private sector. So one of the preconditions for successful outsourcing will be some additional investment in management staff in order to manage those contracts more appropriately. And in a city that worships the front line, worships the teller rather than the bank, we're going to have to figure out that balance a little bit. That's not an easy sell for council.
Questions here in the second row.
Don Stevenson. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the situation in Vancouver, where a special tax was put in on very expensive residences. It was foreign owners, but it seems to me that's opened up a little bit of a gap in the taxation of property that with a little creativity, one might be able to fill a bit. There's been a huge increase in wealth in real estate in Toronto. It seems to me a bloody shame if somehow the city isn't able to tap it.
So remember that I'm the city manager who depends on land transfer tax. I have mixed incentives in this regard, to be very frank. I think we have to, I don't think we understand what's fully happened in Vancouver yet. I don't know if we know what's coincidence and what's a function of the tax. I do know that the Government of Canada is concerned about systemic risk, and systemic risk associated with overheating Vancouver and to some extent markets. I know it feels it lacks the toolkit in order to address that through the traditional macro bank and regulatory tools. It's nibbled around the edges. It's opened up a dialogue with BC, Ontario, and the municipalities in order to figure out other mechanisms for that. I'm on the task force. It's not an open and shut case either way. And if we were to do that, it is something that you put in mind to slow a market. And if we are slowing a market, that means we believe the market's overheated, and we want to be a little bit cautious about that assumption given our revenue profile and our really very substantial dependence on land transfer tax as a measure. So it's a great question, and one in which I have profoundly mixed feelings, as you can tell from my answer, Don.
Hi, Steve Monroe. You, of course, all budgets discuss there's the operating budget and the capital budget. But there are really three budgets because capital has two components, one of which has become more and more important in Toronto, which is state of good repair. And we like to pretend that capital is quote unquote one-time costs. So we can do things like selling spare properties or privatizing hydro or things like that to pay for capital. The problem is that state of good repair is every year over and over and over again, and in assets that age, like subways, it grows year over year simply because it's like a house. A 100-year-old house costs more to maintain than one that was just built yesterday. So to what extent is the city going to look at carving the capital budget really into two pieces where you say, this is what our state of good repair budget looks like, and this is the money you need, just as you need money on the what is called quote-unquote operating budget to keep the lights on, and say, okay, these, you got an operating budget and you've got a state of good repair budget, and you got to fund all of these before you even think about any new projects. And I think that's a case where there hasn't been enough of a distinction, and certainly if there's going to be a multi-year plan, you're going to have to show what that base state of good repair funding is before anybody can have a photo op to announce a new subway line or park or whatever.
So great question, and I do appreciate it. In a pragmatic sense, I'm going to give a pragmatic answer. And the pragmatic answer is that I started off by acknowledging the need for new revenue. It's going to be unlikely, it's more challenging, and I've already talked about the need for additional revenue to support some of the operating. I think on the capital side, we are going to use some of that additional revenue to make some of the new announcements. Money is fungible. That does open up space on the other. Practical sense, it's very hard to draw the discipline, but that's actually one of the problems we have, where even though we have a 10-year capital plan, we are, we don't have council with a deep understanding of it. It's not used as a tool to provide much forward guidance to council, and we do need to do a better job as a public service in terms of being able to provide multi-year operating and capital projections, and then a multi-year understanding of what types of revenue measures might be necessary in order to meet those policy expectations, the extent to which we can realistically rely on savings and other such things. That's a fairly complicated set of calculations. We're in the middle of working through that now.
Having such a good time, I just got the signal we got to end because we are at 6 o'clock. I want to ask you to join me in thanking Peter for a very thoughtful, provocative presentation discussion. I knew he would not disappoint us, and I want to wish members of council and the mayor all the best in dealing with, which I think it is time to constantly deal with the long-term bold city building objectives. For example, we didn't get a chance to talk about the rail deck park, which I think is just amazing. And I think that's the kind of thing we need.
I love all that stuff.
But immediately, of course, we got members of council, we got the city manager saying, can't afford it, can't pay for it. But we do need to keep thinking and keep putting that in place as we deal with the immediate 2017-18 budget as well. So all the very best to council, to Mayor Tory, to City Manager Peter Wallace. So please join me in thanking Peter for this.
While I'm still in that car going down the dark dirt road with the parking lights on and wondering where we're going to end up, I also want to thank you, Peter, for a fantastic presentation today. I like the way you talk about revenues. You talked about aligning revenues with policy intentions. Another time you said we need to match resources to ambition. So often we start talking about how much we're going to increase the property tax, and we work backwards from there instead of saying what kind of city do we want, how are we going to pay for it. So I was happy to see you more with a vision and then how to pay for it. And I'd also like to thank Shirley for asking some tough questions and for moderating the session today. It's been a really interesting day. And Peter, we hope you and the Jays will come back next year. Thank you, everyone.